All right, guys, let's get started. So we're graphing sine and cosine functions, usually written in the form a sine bx minus c plus d. A, b, c, and d are just values. The a is the amplitude, how far up and downwards the wave will go. To find b is always the coefficient of x, and it's vital because it tells us the period, which is what one wave or one cycle is worth. After that, the graph will just repeat again and again. So once we know what one period looks like, we know what the rest of the graph is going to look like. C, anything added or subtracted in the parentheses tells us a horizontal shift, and that's not any different in a trig graph. Same thing with D, anything added or subtracted outside of the parentheses tells us a vertical translation. So make a note of the following things. This graph for sine and cosine will always have a phase shift of C over B, which are the values in the parentheses. To find the start value, you set your parentheses equal to 0 because that's where the start of one circle is. And to find the end value of one period or one cycle or one wave, you set your parentheses equal to 2 pi. And then from there, you'll solve for x. So I put up an example here. You're going to graph y equals 2 cosine x plus pi. So the first thing I always like to do is just identify what I have. So a is always multiplied in front of the trig function, which would be 2. B is the coefficient of x. So if you look in front of x, there's nothing there, which means it has a coefficient of 1. So b equals to 1, and with that we can find our period, which is 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi over 1, and that just gives us a period of 2 pi. So we do have a horizontal translation here, but not a vertical translation, just something to note. I'm going to start by finding the x values. So there are 5 points to each period. So to find out where the starting x value is, again, you're going to just set your parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. So here, x plus pi equals to 0. I'll solve subtracting pi on both sides, giving me x equals negative pi. That's the start. And then where the end value of one period is for the x coordinates, I'm going to set my parentheses equal to 2 pi. And in this case, if I subtract pi on both sides, 2 pi minus 1 pi would just give me pi. So again, when you graph, you will have 5 points in a period. So we know that the starting is negative pi. So the last point will be at pi, but what about the points in between? So this is where the difference between the x values come in. So you're going to take the end point minus the start point and divide it by 4. Makes sense because if you have 5 points, there's 4 equal spaces between them. So to find the difference, I'm going to take pi minus negative pi over 4. Pi minus negative pi, these two negatives become a positive, which gives me 2 pi over 4, which is just pi over 2. So this is the difference between each x value. Sorry, pen's fading out a little bit. All right, so each time I'm going to add pi over 4. Do you really have to add with pi? You do not. You can just think of it as negative 1 plus, instead of pi over 2, 1 over 2. So negative 1 plus a half would just give me negative a half. Just bring the pi over, negative pi over 2. Negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2. So negative 1 half plus a half would just give me 0. And 0 plus pi over 2 would give me pi over 2. And then last point, pi over 2 plus pi over 2, good way to check, does give me pi. So once you have the x, you can do what you have always done to find the y values, and that's to plug it back into the original form. So for instance, let me try to find a little space to make my graph here. I know there's not a lot of space, but negative pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, pi. So there's all my x values. If I plug this in, the first x value is negative pi. Negative pi plus pi is 0. So 2 going to write it up here. I know it's a little messy, but bear with me. I'm not working with a lot of room here since I put all my notes in this page. So 2 cosine of 0. Well, what's the cosine of 0? That would be 1. And then 1 times 2 is 2. So when x is negative pi, the y value is 2. I'm making a point right there. Next up is negative pi over 2. So I'm going to plug it in. Negative pi over 2 plus pi. It's just like adding negative 1/2 plus 1. It would give me pi over 2. So using a little sidebar over here as well, 2 cosine pi over 2. What's the cosine of pi over 2? It's 0. And then 0 times 2 would give me 0. So when I'm at negative pi over 2, my y value is 0. And then from here, I'm going to plug in 0. 0 plus pi is pi. Cosine of pi is negative 1. And negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. So the fun fact about cosine and sine are that they're waves. So once you actually get the minimum, the maximum, and the intercept value in between, you should be able to just kind of see the graph from there. If not, keep plugging in the x values. So once this goes downwards, it's just going to go right back to 0 and 2. And that's one period, one cycle, one wave. After that, everything will continuously repeat, meaning the x values will still have a difference of pi over 2 between each one of them. The wave will still go upwards and then downwards. So once you have one cycle or one period, you're good to go. And just so we're good, I have a second graph, which I'll start in another video.